Back live with Andrew Bolt with the Bolt Report.
Indonesia's been hit by 9 earthquakes this year. The latest, a 7.4 magnitude quake on Friday that caused a tsunami up to 6 metres high that smashed into 2 cities on Palu, including Palu in Sulawesi. And that caused terrible damage. And the death toll so far, more than 840 people. That's almost certain to rise. Joining me is Kevin McHugh, Adjunct Professor at Central Queensland University, former President of the Australian Earthquake Engineering Society, and now Director of the Australian Seismological Centre. Kevin, that's very kind of you to join us. How bad do you think this earthquake was on the scale of ones we're used to seeing at the moment?
Hello, Andrew. They don't get much worse than this, really. The main city, Palu, is right on the edge of the fault that ruptured during the earthquake. The rupture was probably about 200 kilometres long, looking at the aftershock distribution. And they didn't have much going for them. A number of other things. There obviously is no regulator in Indonesia to ensure that the building code, which is a reasonably modern code, to ensure that that code is carried out in the buildings. So buildings were very badly damaged. There was no thought given to the foundation problems, and we've all known about liquefaction for a number of years now, certainly since Christchurch, and for my own case since the mid-70s when I studied the effect in school. But so couldn't have got much worse.
It's interesting you raise those things, Kevin, because they go to why the death toll is so high. The poverty seems to play a part here. It's impossible to imagine the same death toll had such a thing occurred, say, off Sydney. Because one of the things was apparently, now these are early reports obviously, a high-tech system of sensors to warn residents reportedly put on hold. No alerts sounded in some areas, as there was, reportedly, no electricity to power the sirens. I mean, poor countries seem more vulnerable for this kind of catastrophe, don't they?
Well, building regulations apply to all buildings, whether they're owned by poor people or rich people. If an earthquake like this had happened off Sydney, I regret to say that the results would be unthinkable, for one of the same reasons that people don't obey the building regulations in Australia either. So it's not just a problem of Indonesia versus Australia or Indonesia versus any other country. There are no regulators in Australia to ensure that the building code is enacted in Australia, and I think the Earthquake Engineering Society would be one of the first people to agree that those regulations are not carried out.
Kevin, that is a very interesting warning. Indonesia's deadliest earthquake and tsunami is actually, in recent times, was 2004, around 100,000 people dead, unimaginable. This is now 9 earthquakes this year alone in Indonesia. Why is Indonesia so vulnerable?
Yes, it's a good question. It's right at the collision zone of 3 major plates. So we've got the Australian plate, which is moving north at about 7 metres per 100 years. The Pacific plate is moving east at about 10 metres per 100 years relative to the Eurasian plate. And Indonesia's right in that collision zone of those, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, right in the collision zone of those 3 plates. They have earthquakes, they have them regularly. They've had 2 earthquakes in the last 80 years of this size in the same similar place within 100 kilometres. So you'd think they would be well aware of what to do during an earthquake.
Well, that raises a question then. Are earthquakes in fact becoming more frequent either in our area or around the world?
Well, we've been recording earthquakes for about 120 years. The first seismographs were installed then. There's no evidence that earthquakes are becoming more frequent or changing. They don't occur regularly in time. You get them in clusters, so there have been 5, I think, magnitude 7.5 earthquakes around the world this year, which is about average. 4 or 5 we normally have. But if one happens in the middle of the Southern Ocean, it's very likely that nobody would have felt it. The critical thing here for Palu is that the earthquake occurred right under it, so its proximity to the fault, and the fault was about 200 kilometres long, so some of the major population centres along that fault all suffered the same fate. And the one other thing that is a little bit surprising in this case is that there was such a terrible tsunami, but I think the probably what happened, because this is a strike-slip fault like the faults through Wellington, New Zealand, or San Francisco in California, it's a strike-slip fault, so there's no vertical tectonic displacement during the earthquake. But I think in this case, there's a very deep trench in the Makassar Strait, and so you have the trench has actually been cut off by the faulting, and so you've had rapid displacement of water in that way. And I think this is a tsunami that was generated in a fairly unique way. And then, of course, you had that bay leading into Palu, which focused the tsunami right onto the city. So it's a combination of a whole lot of horrible factors.
Kevin McHugh, thank you so much indeed for that fascinating insight. Appreciate that.
Pleasure, Andrew.